Hi. Walter Rauschenbusch has been discussing the difference between the heritage or the legacy of Roman civilization on the West and the comparative ignorance of the Jewish heritage, that is the Old Testament heritage upon the West, especially marked in the area of what he calls the excessive reverence for private property rights, which shows much to Rome but very little to the Old Testament. And he's contrasting, of course, the Old Testament emphasis upon the rights of the individual, not the individual human, the individual family. So we have a great reverence for individual rights in the West, but at the expense of, well, both community now, and even in Rauschenbusch's day, and especially the family. The individual rights have now trounced or trampled upon the rights of the family. And the rights of family inheritance, the land, for instance, that Rauschenbusch has been talking about, protected by both the Sabbath year legislation, the canceling of debts, and especially by the Jubilee, which, as far as we can tell, was never enacted for very obvious reasons, even in the Old Testament days. So he goes on with this subhead, the effect of the social interest on the religious life. Rauschenbusch says, this is page 22 of Christianity and Social Crisis, we rightly hold that social ideals of such moral value could grow only out of a religious life of high value. But the reverse is also historically true, that the high religious life of Israel could develop only within a nation that cherished and maintained such social ideals. We have seen that the religion of the prophets was not the quiet devoutness of private religion. They lived in the open air of national life. Every heartbeat of their nation was registered in the pulse throb of the prophets. They made the history of their nation, but in turn the history of their nation made them. They looked open-eyed at the events about them and then turned to the inner voice of God to interpret what they saw. They went to school with a living God who was then at work in his world, and not with a God who had acted long ago and put it down in a book. They learned religion by the laboratory method of studying contemporary life. Consequently, their conception of God and of God's purposes was enlarged and clarified as their political horizon grew wider and clearer. The first rise of widespread prophetism, of which we have any record in Israel, was historically connected with the raids and invasions of the Philistines about 1020 BC. Against their united and disciplined forces, the scattered tribes were helpless. The national calamity created a religious revival. We catch glimpses of bands of prophets moving about in rhythmical processions with music and song, spreading a contagious religious ecstasy. In Samuel, the popular emotion found a practical, statesman-like expression. The result was the election of the first king, the most important step toward organized national unity. As in the case of the American colonies and of the German states, the pressure of a great war was the only force sufficient to crystallize the loose ingredients of Israel into a nation. But the same national crisis which created the kingship also inaugurated the higher career of the prophetic order. There had been prophets in Israel before. They were a religious phenomenon common to all the Semitic peoples, but they had been mainly soothsayers, using their clairvoyant powers for anyone who needed them and paid them for their service. Their ecstatic raptures and their predictions had not been based on any fundamental moral convictions. The patriotic enthusiasm of the uprising against Philistine domination began to lift the prophets clear of the function and the magical implements of soothsaying, and cut them loose from ceremonial ritual in general. These functions now fell to the priests. This was probably the very greatest relief which prophecy experienced in the course of its evolution, according to George Adam Smith in the Book of the 12 Prophets. Henceforth, they were free to take that independent or hostile attitude to ritual religion to which we have referred, and their predictions henceforth were national in scope and based on fundamental moral laws and convictions. Thus, patriotism was the emancipating power which set the feet of the prophetic order on that new and higher path which was destined to lift them far above the soothsayers of other nations with whom they started on a common level. That religious passion, which had turned against a foreign invader, was equally ready to turn against the domestic oppressors of the people. The new series of prophets, which began with Amos about 755 BC, was summoned to action by a vaster danger than that of the Philistine invaders. The empire of Assyria was rising on the eastern horizon like a cyclone cloud. It moved down on the cluster of little kingdoms in Syria and Palestine with irresistible force. Assyria was the first of those great powers which were destined to grind up the tribal nationalities of the ancient Orient, and out of the detritus to form new conglomerate formations on a grander scale. What Assyria began, Chaldea, that is Babylon, and the Greeks continued, and the Romans completed. We can see now that the process was inevitable and necessary for the development of a wider and higher civilization. But for those who got between the millstones, it was terror and agony. Napoleon playing at ninepins with the kingdoms of Europe, or the white race dividing the earth during the 19th century, are mild modern parallels. So it's interesting he brings Napoleon into it. Didn't realize, of course, in 1907 when this was written, that we'd have something even worse than Napoleon within 7 years, and we'd have something much worse than even that within another generation or so. Hitlerism. So I'm linking to a discussion by Gerhard von Rad, the great German theologian and Old Testament scholar, a video we shot on von Rad's comments from his Old Testament theology on empire and Goliath, Assyria, and Hitler.